Welcome, everyone, to Agency Rainmaker TV. How do we make it rain? Which means, how do we get more clients? Well, the best book on business development that I've read in the last 5 years is The Widest Net by Pamela Slim. And I'm so honored that Pamela would join us today. Pamela, welcome. And what are you going to tell us about?
I am so excited to be here and thank you so much for the kind words. I'm going to tell you about ways to find ideal clients in watering holes as opposed to just trying to get everybody to rush over to you.
There you go. I've written about Pamela twice in Forbes.com. One was on the watering holes. And then just this month in February, I was down at a Super Bowl event where they were promoting drug abstinence for youth. And I had lunch with Pamela and interviewed her and included 10 tips she has for building relationships and testing out relationship partners. Very timely information. So, Pamela, first question is, who is your who? Who is the audience that you serve?
Hi, who's are thought leaders. I call them architects of liberatory change. And the reason I do is I tend to like to work with people who are really big thinkers, who are creating tools and ideas that are really making a more fair, equitable future for us all. So professionally, they are data scientists and doctors and consultants, authors, but they tend to be putting forward ideas that are more focused on creating a more fair, equitable world.
That's a very noble work that you've taken on there. I know also in Mesa, Arizona, you have a community center where you bring in people from the community and there's sharing of ideas. And again, just a worthwhile thing. How did the genesis of that take place?
For our learning lab here?
Yeah, I'd just like to
Yeah,
hear about the Learning Lab.
for sure. So it really was all part, I think, of the development of the book, The Widest Net. I started in finding this space here. I had had a office in East Mesa, where I live in Arizona, and it was a great office, but smaller. I was looking to have a more interesting place to have my office downtown. And actually, when I peeked in the window, I got excited at this big space where I saw all kinds of potential to not only have my office, but also to have community gatherings. My degree in college was actually in community development, economic development. And so I've always been interested in being more engaged with my local community, even though at that time, most of my clients, as most are now, are all over the world who I see through Zoom. The way in which we really got the Learning Lab up and running was using the methodology in the Widest Net. So it became a really fun experiment for me, a test of the method to see how I could show up pretty much unknown on my own main street in Mesa, and over the period of years become what I call now a professional busybody. But there is hardly a person here downtown, including the mayor, city council, all the business owners, that doesn't know me. And it's because I love people, but it's also because we've really used a very specific method to build relationships and build community.
Let's go back to a scary time. So we're going to do a horror story here. The scary time is Friday the 13th. It's Friday, March 13th,
Mm.
2020,
Mhm.
and you had to go through the lockdown. And what was your evolution during the last 3 years?
Thankfully for me, it was not as scary because I have had a virtual practice for so many years. And because I work with people that are all over the world geographically in different stages of business and in different types of businesses, I wasn't as personally affected as certainly a lot of my colleagues were here downtown who had restaurants and other brick and mortar areas. We were able to just shutter our physical office as we were sheltering at home as everybody else was. A lot of my focus was in helping my clients understand how they could find sometimes new pathways to new audiences. Certainly for folks that I work with who had made a very healthy living speaking on stages, that was an exceptionally terrifying time where they basically had to real time reinvent their offerings, their product services, and mechanisms of delivery. So that's where I drew upon many decades of experience as a learning and development professional and just help people to very rapidly evolve new offerings that were delivered virtually.
In January of 2020, we had a strategic meeting at Indie Books, and one of the objectives was let's get Henry to travel less. Let's get Henry off the road more. And we tested 2 Zoom events in January and February, which we botched horribly. And then be careful what you ask the universe or God for, because certainly it came through that I got off the road. And all of a sudden we had to help all our authors learn to navigate Zoom and present and market that way. We grew 20% during the pandemic. So we were leading the way like you. Before we go much farther, I'd be remiss if we didn't mention one of your earlier books. And I know all my books are my children, and like my children, I expect them to take care of me in my old age. Tell us about your Cubicle book, your child.
Yes, so my first book was Escape from Cubicle Nation that came out in 2009. And it is funny. When we went through the Great Resignation, I had to stop myself sometimes from saying, I told you so. I tend to see a bit in the future in terms of trends. I had been actually a very satisfied and happy management consultant for about the first 10 years of my business. I came out of corporate. I was the director of training and development at Barclays Global Investors, which is now BlackRock. And so I spent about 10 years working on the human side of business. I just found there were people who were not happy in corporate, who wanted to leave and start a business, and it felt like a leap that was just too big for them. So I started with a blog that ended up turning into my first book with Penguin Portfolio, now Penguin Random House. And it is pretty interesting to me now. Some of the things that I foresaw that I wrote about in that book all the way back in 2009 ended up coming true. And some of it, as we said, were driven by the pandemic, where companies that thought they could control things much more, thought they could just operate the way they always have operated, not realizing people needed to be managed differently, ended up really losing a lot of folks out of the workforce. So I always underline and state the fact that I'm not anti-corporate. I know for me, now 27 years into owning my own business, I wouldn't have it another way. But I certainly work with plenty of people who enjoy whatever work mode they're in, be it a university or a government entity, a nonprofit. My main thing is find the work mode that fits for you.
Cubicle Nation changed a lot of lives. I read a book in the late 90s when I was in corporate, and it was uh, Die Broke. And the whole
Mm,
premise of the book is there's going to be lots of work and there's not going to be a lot of jobs.
mm,
The jobs are going away. And the whole thing was rethink everything. So, one thing, retirement, think about accumulating a fortune, think about having streams of revenue so that really you live comfortably, but you die broke. Also, think about yourself as a freelancer, like the old knights who didn't belong to anybody, but their lance was for hire, and focus on your growth and all that. So, in your book, Cubicle Nation accelerated that. I have to admit, I still have nightmares that I'm working corporate, and a boss is coming by and saying, "Yeah, we need you in Detroit on Saturday, and we're going to need you to go to Cleveland and then Pittsburgh and get back up." To Chicago by Monday for meeting. I was like, ugh. So, but let's leave that behind. Let's talk about your new work, because you preach what you practice to people about
mm,
being a thought leader.
mhm.
You demonstrate everything you're encouraging people to do. Um, Give us the what. What are you encouraging people to do to be a thought leader?
So the premise of the widest net, if we just contrast it with what I call empire culture, which is the method and the focus of building your business so that you are the sole focus, you're the sole expert. We often talk about audience that way in terms of fans and followers, really positioning yourself specifically against certain competitors, not wanting to really share a lot of information. That's a lot of the way that people think that they need to be in business. What I have found personally, professionally for many decades now in the way that I build a business is rather that we center our ideal client or customer. So you and I, as an example, Henry, we share some similar clients, people who have big ideas, who want to get them out in the world through things like books, through training programs, sometimes what I help them with, and also who want to find readers for their books and clients for their business. And so if we think about centering our ideal customer in the center of an ecosystem of which you and I are a part. And there also are a lot of other people that are providing resources, support, information to also help those clients reach those goals. Then really our job is to understand who are the best, smartest people within that ecosystem that we can connect our clients to, but also where are the watering holes, which are places in person and online where somebody wonderful has already gathered large amounts of our ideal clients in one place. So that when we go to that place, I know you and I think first met at an AMI, Drew McClellan's event in Chicago, where in that room, you couldn't walk 1 foot without bumping into a lovely person that ran a marketing agency. And that was a great place to speak, where we know that we both do work with those people. When we were there, especially knowing that we share values with somebody like Drew, who has a certain approach to business that's resonate with ours, then it's much easier to build connections there in order to reach ideal clients. So you can look at things like events as watering holes, being on a show like this or being on a podcast is a way, one to many, you can get exposure. And being strategic about how you do that, to me, is the key to having a very successful business where you're really just referring a lot of business back and forth to each other.
You mentioned AMI, Drew McClellan, and it wasn't just the demographics of who was in the room, small to mid-sized agencies, 5 to 200 employees. The psychographics of these were abundance mentality thinkers. These people who were extroverts, but they were also, would say, thoughtful. They dove deep. So it wasn't just a slice of the pie. And someone mentioned about our 150 authors at Indie Books. He said, everyone seems to be spiritual. I don't mean, religion. I mean, different faiths, but they all have this spiritual base. I'm guessing that's not a coincidence. I said, well, no, we have a 23-point profile of our ideal fit. And when we interview people, that's one of the things we look for. Because it's just another approach to life. So your, what do you want to say? Your actions, Pamela, scream so loud I can't hear you talking. You're so generous. You're so sharing. It just comes through so loud and clear that like people want to be attracted to be with you, and that's a good thing to be. That's not an accident on your part either, is it?
It's not. And I think that it's the combination of being very deliberate about the kind of work you love to do. You have to be able to describe in very clear terms who is an ideal client for you. You and I, when we were here together a couple weeks ago, were with Susan Beyer from Audience Audit, whose method I use in the Widest Net, who always encourages us to be defining our ideal audience by problem, challenge, or aspiration, and then adding the demographics. So when we think about even different ways that we've described who's an ideal author for you, who are ideal folks that I work with, I definitely want to work with people with big ideas, but in particular, ideas that might lean more toward building an equitable world. And so little nuances like this, when we're able to describe it, can help us figure out where the places that also are serving people like that. And the more specific you get, it just makes it easier. It's like you're more likely to roll into a dinner party that is really enjoyable, as opposed to just knocking on a random door and hoping and praying. I think like a lot of people do, they're like, my business coach told me I just needed to network more. And so they just go out to any group. And as we know, if we've been around the business world for a while, not all groups vibe is the same. I think there's a group that is a perfect fit for one person that's probably the exact opposite fit for somebody else. So the more that you're strategic about it from the beginning, you save time. And when you build some of these strong referral partnerships, what I call peanut butter and jelly partnerships, so especially with people who have a highly complementary but non-competitive service, it just means you spend more time in places where you feel good and you're connected with all of the right clients, as opposed to stumbling around or just yelling at the internet, like hoping that people hear you and come back and choose to work for you.
I like to tell people it's not about meeting strangers on the internet. That's not the secret here. You mentioned Susan Beyer of Audience Audit, and that's a great example for your theory or your strategy here,
Hmm.
in that Susan and I both serve the same audience. Susan provides a service I've recommended that they have for years. I didn't have someone I could send them to. Um, Susan, doing her research, says this would be great for a book, but didn't have somebody to send them to that she could trust to help them prepare, do the book, take care of them like she would take care of them. So it came out today in an interview. Somebody said, well, how big are you? And I said, well, it's 5 W-2s and 25 1099s, because for all these things that we need, we have relationships with people who we can send you to. And I ticked off several. And he was saying, oh, great. That's what I wanted. Um, in this virtual area, I had 40 people working for me once
Hmm.
at an agency. I don't have nightmares about it, but almost. I don't want that many W-2s, and I salute the people who are willing to do that. I rather be mobile and lean and able to pivot and bring in the people who offer great things. There's a great thing that you offer, I'd like you to talk about, if you wouldn't mind, is your program to help people license their content. They might be a thought leader, they have a system, a process for solving problems, and it would just be a shame if it disappeared with them. So to pass it on as a legacy, it's a train the trainer type of thing. It's a license it out. What's your philosophy on that?
So yeah, based on the work that I did for so many years in both in corporate, so seeing a lot of programs that came in that could have been from folks who had a program that ended up having licensing or certification, and then also doing management consulting for so many years, I built a lot of programs for larger companies. And for us, I have a small team that works with thought leaders. Really, the best situation is somebody who is delivering a really interesting, powerful, usually a workshop or maybe a set of tools, a certain kind of specific assessment, where the client is like, I love it when you are delivering it, but we have these 2,000 other managers that could so benefit from it. It would be usually prohibitively expensive for that team of people delivering the workshop to do it for 2,000 people. So that's where, as you were saying, we can build a specific train the trainer program where the thought leader really develops the method. The method needs to be pretty clearly defined in order to take it to the next stage of licensing and certification. But that's where you define a method by which you select specific people who could be trained either inside a company to deliver it for the company or outside as individual professionals. And with that, there's specific choices that you need to make about how you organize and structure the materials, how you test and evaluate if people are fully capable of representing your material and being the steward that material deserves. And then the licensing piece is simply working with an IP attorney to make sure that everything is tied up so they know exactly what they can utilize for how long, for how much in that licensing agreement. So it's really fun. It feels like this nice extension of work that I've done for a long time. And it is for people who are at a stage of business where there is a growing demand for their tools, because we know you can build something, but people won't necessarily come. And so
Yeah.
where people are already asking for it, it can be a really wonderful method of delivery and very lucrative for the thought leader.
Yeah, you can go broke on giving people what you think they need. You can be rich in a niche if you give them what they want. So that's
Yes.
that's a good guiding principle. I too have been in management consulting and associated with groups like the Institute of Management Consultants. May I tell you my management consultant joke? There are
Please.
a lot of them. It's like attorneys. A lot of attorney jokes, a lot of management consultant jokes. When they need us, they really need us. But other than that, they make the jokes. It was a New Yorker cartoon, and it was like one of those scenes in Law and Order. Two cops standing over a body, and one cop says, "Judging by the number of knife wounds in the victim's back, I have to guess he was a management consultant."
Yes.
So
That is true. That
there
is
we
true.
go.
As I would always tell aspiring consultants, they're going to blame you. If the blame is going to come, when the glory comes, probably you won't get it. But that is part of the nobility of the profession, is that you do what's right for the clients. When you're doing it right, you're doing
Yeah.
it to make the company and the organization stronger. But for
Oh,
sure,
I agree with you
uh,
so much. We
yeah,
trace the origin back all the way to Roman times, and like a family would associate themselves with an aristocrat, and it wasn't like they were servants or something, but it was like our family is attached to that aristocrat, and when you needed something, they would represent you and like you were family and take care of things. And then, sometimes a favor would be needed, and if your family could help the aristocrat out, you would do that. So I find it a very honorable and noble profession of people helping. My saying was, um, success has many parents, failure is an orphan, and the orphan is at your doorstep if
that's
you're the
right.
consultant. So I get you totally. It's been so great talking with you. Any message you wanted to share before we close off the show?
I just would love to connect. I'm on LinkedIn frequently, so if anybody listening is interested in the ideas, I would love to learn more about you, and you can just connect over there at Pamela Slim, and I can be found at PamelaSlim.com.
You should go to PamelaSlim.com, and let me tell you why. Again, she demonstrates everything she teaches. There's lots of generosity there with templates and ways of doing things, and just added benefit to it. Um, uh, call it karma, call it kismet, call it the law of reciprocation, call it what you will, but I just know the more generous you are, the luckier you get in business. So thank you for your generosity, Pamela. And that's a wrap on this episode of Agency Rainmaker. So please remember, make it rain.